Okay, I think I might start if that's all right. There's just one more person just arrived. I'll let them in and then we'll get going. So thanks very much to everyone for coming along. This is the second of these webinars which we've held, where what we're trying to do is to have sort of contact with the public a bit about the work that we're doing in the Birmingham BabyLab, the kinds of research we're doing, and also not just to tell you about what we're doing, but to hear from you what your thoughts are about infants and infant research, what kinds of research ought to be done. So yeah, we're very keen to hear from you as well, and there's some time at the end of this session to talk about that. So just a couple of kind of arrangements to start off with. So the mics are automatically muted. Whilst the talks are going on, please, when we have questions at the end, of course, please do switch the mics on and fire away. So we switched videos off as a default because we're recording this session and we want to publicize it online afterwards. But you're welcome to switch the video on if you would like, but just be aware that we're hoping to publicize this afterwards and to post it on the website. The discussion session at the end, so when there's a chance to ask questions and so forth, we won't be uploading that to the website, so you can let loose a little bit more at that stage if you're concerned about that. So if you have any questions at all during the talk, feel free to write them into the chat at any point, and we'll try and pick them up as we go along, as and where there's space and time to do that. But also, you're welcome to hold on to your questions, and we'll try to address them at the end. And we can either do that on audio visual questions and answers on Zoom, or we can do it via the chat function. So feel free to just type your questions in, and we'll answer them there also. And without further ado, I'll just head on to the content. So for the first 15 minutes, I'm going to talk about infants' perceptions of their social worlds, and a bit about what we know about that broad area of research. I'm really going to be sort of glossing over what's really quite a massive literature in developmental psychology, but giving some of the highlights for me about how infants perceive their social worlds. And then after me, Alice Cousins, who's just joined the Birmingham BabyLab to start a PhD on self-perception, is going to talk a little bit about some new ideas which she's developing on how to understand self-perception in early infancy and self-awareness. And then after Alice, Sophie's going to talk quickly about keeping up to date with the Birmingham BabyLab, and then we'll open up for some discussion and questions and answers. So we're really keen to hear from you all at that point. But like I say, do please ask questions in the chat all the way through if you would like. Okay, so I'm going to talk about infants' perceptions of their social worlds. I'm going to talk a bit about how babies perceive their social world at birth, but also even prior to birth in utero, as when they're known as fetuses. And I'll talk not just about how they perceive their visual world, but how they perceive the social world of people and interactions with people through multiple senses, so not just vision, but hearing and touch, and also olfaction, the world of smell. And after so postnatally, in the first year of life, there's obviously some important changes in how babies perceive their social world. So I'm going to be covering some of the key things that we've learned about how infants develop in their ability to perceive the world of people around them. So, some of the most important landmark studies of our understanding of how infants are actually really quite competent at perceiving and recognizing the social world from early on come from studies of fetuses. So we've known for a long time, and actually many parents will, so mothers in particular, will be able to attest to the fact that even from quite early on in gestation, and fetuses will startle at the sound of loud noises in the environment, so you'll be able to feel them jumping. And so that obviously indicates that the auditory system is functional well before birth. But we also know actually from research in the 1980s by Bill Pfeiffer and William de Casper and colleagues that infants can learn quite a lot from the sounds which they're exposed to in utero. So De Casper and Pfeiffer in 1980, and also De Casper and Spencer in 1986, published some really important studies in this area using something called the non-nutritive sucking technique. And this, I won't go into too much detail about that because it's relatively complicated, you know, the way in which they did things. But it basically builds or capitalizes on the fact that newborn babies will tend to suck more when they're perceiving something nice. And that could be something gustatory. So if they have a sweet taste in their mouth, they tend to suck a little bit more, which is obviously useful, you know, when they're drinking milk, then they're going to be sucking more and ingesting that more. But they also do that when they have pleasant things, pleasant sensations in other senses as well. So the sound of a voice which they like, they tend to suck more also. What De Casper and Pfeiffer did was ask prenatal mums to read to their day for a couple of weeks prior to birth, from a popular Dr. Seuss story, The Cat in the Hat. And they were asked to read a particular passage from that. And then postnatally, when the babies had been born, they then played the babies a recording of either their mother reading that passage from Cat in the Hat or a strange mother reading that passage from A Cat in the Hat. And the babies suck more, basically, when they hear their own mother speaking. So that indicates that, you know, even during prenatal life, infants are learning about the sounds of their own parents' voices. So they're learning to identify particular people by the sounds that they make. Not only that, but De Casper and Spence found that if you ask parents to read a particular passage from Cat in the Hat, and then postnatally a strange mother either reads the same passage that was being read or a different passage, then the newborn babies will suck more in response to the passage which they heard their mother speaking, even though it's being read by a complete stranger, in preference to the passage which they'd never heard before. So that suggests that not only can they identify particular individual people from the sounds that they're hearing in utero, but also they can recognize particular patterns of speech. It's probably unlikely that they're recognizing the words, of course, but probably something about the intonation patterns they're learning about that even prior to birth. So that was, you know, really quite striking when those findings were published in the 1980s. Now, last time we had a webinar, I mean, I know some of you won't have been there, but some will. But we talked a little bit about infants, fetuses' visual abilities in utero. So it's been known relatively recently now, it was shown that actually there's quite a lot of light in the uterus prior to birth, and that there's some stuff for the babies to see, for fetuses to see prior to birth. And Reed and colleagues in the University of Lancaster showed that that when you present patterns of dots in a face-like configuration with two eyes at the top and a mouth, so face-like, it's very vaguely a face with a mouth at the bottom, versus the inverted pattern, then even at 35 weeks gestation, and babies are more likely to look towards, orient their eyes towards that face-like configuration of dots rather than the other configuration of dots. And they've measured that by using ultrasound, by looking at babies' head and eye movements using 4D ultrasound. And that mirrors findings which we know that newborn babies only 30 minutes of age, in fact, show those similar preferences when they've just arrived in the world. But this finding is really striking, and that indicates that babies know something about faces or the configuration of faces even before they've had any visual experience of them whatsoever. So that suggests that not only can they learn about the social world in the uterus, but they may well be programmed, humans may well be pre-programmed to know something about the visual patterning of the social world. Now, obviously, there's some kind of questions about whether these are really face preferences that they're showing, because they're kind of weird, abstract patterns of dots. But people have argued that nonetheless, even if that is the case, this will mean that babies orient more towards faces in the real world, because they resemble more these kinds of preferences which they have even prior to birth. Teresa Ferroni's done a lot of work in this area with newborn babies in the University of Padova, showing that newborn infants prefer not just to look at faces, but to look at faces which are looking directly at them. So if you can see here, hopefully you can see that one face is looking directly at the observer, the other one has eye gaze averted. And newborn babies of only a couple of days of age will look longer at the face, which is looking directly at them, suggesting that newborn babies, not only do they have a preference to orient towards the social aspects of their environment, but they have a preference to orient and to respond to particularly the aspects of their social environment where there's some kind of communicative interaction going on. So obviously when people look at you, that tends to be in some kind of interactive situation, possibly where you're speaking at the same time as well. And maybe it's the case that infants have a preference for those kinds of interactions because maybe they'll learn a little bit more in those kinds of contexts than when someone's looking in the opposite direction, for instance. And it seems that as adults, we're also set up to encourage these kinds of engagements with infants. So this is a young woman from a group of people in Southwest Africa, in Namibia, called the Himba, who are really remote from Western cultural influence. But you'll see that this young woman, when she's holding this baby, is showing something that seems really quite familiar. Babies, we're raising our eyebrows, making our eyes really big. I mean, I do this to my dog as well. So, so it's kind of attracting attention, really, and making it clear that we're making some kind of social connection between ourselves and the infant in front of us. Okay. So that tells us, the infants, even fetuses prior to birth, preterm and preterm babies, have some kind of awareness of their social world through hearing and vision. But so one study, it's quite controversial, this study. No one's quite sure whether it means exactly what the authors claim it means, but I think it's very interesting nonetheless. And this is a study of co-sharing twins by Castiello and colleagues in 2010. This is another 4D ultrasound study showing that, so when twins grow up, most of the time they're in separate uterine sacs and they can't have tactile interactions, or not in a very easy way. But occasionally there are co-sharing twins who share the same uterine sac. And Castiello and colleagues studied with ultrasound twins in that uterine situation, and they found, interestingly, that there were these changes in how babies would move towards each other as they got older. So they were comparing 14 gestational weeks and 18 gestational weeks, and they found that there was an increase in the percentage of movements that babies started to make, not just to themselves, but to the uterine wall around them, but also towards the co-sharing twin. So they started to have more interest in touching the co-sharing twin, as well as touching themselves and the uterine wall. They also found that that movements towards the co-sharing twin between 14 and 18 weeks started to show more deceleration patterns, as if they're not just kind of lashing out and touching anything that just happens to be in the way, but they're intentionally moving towards and touching, but not only that, but touching gently the co-sharing twin. They're decelerating as they approach because they know they're about to come into tactile contact. And Castiello et al. Concluded from this that twin fetuses are not just touching each other accidentally, but they're actually intentionally caressing each other in utero through these kinds of tactile interactions, which is it's a fascinating idea that this kind of social awareness could be so well developed at 18 weeks of gestation. So that's only essentially 4 or 5 months of prenatal life. So our social worlds aren't just tactile, auditory, and visual, but also that there's an important olfactory or smell aspect to the social world. And actually it's thought that this might be particularly important to newborn babies. So the sense of the smell and taste are actually among the first to develop in utero, alongside touch, which is also very early. And lots of this research has been pioneered by French scientists, Benoit Charles in particular. Benoit Charles done these slightly queasy making experiments where Charles looks at whether newborns have a preference to orient towards pads containing their own mother's amniotic fluid versus pads containing the amniotic fluid of another mother. And he finds that newborns will indeed prefer to orient their heads towards the smell of their own mother's amniotic fluid as opposed to a strange mother's amniotic fluid. They also find that's the case with colostrum. So even before the first feeding, newborns will orient by preference to the smell of the colostrum of their own mother, as opposed to the smell of the colostrum of another mother. And in fact, they seem to find that there's no ability to differentiate between the smell of amniotic fluid and colostrum. And their account of this is that what you're learning in utero in the chemosensory environment is the smell of not just amniotic fluid, not just colostrum, but the smell of your parent. And so when you emerge into the outside world, where you're not surrounded by amniotic fluid anymore, but you are surrounded by other smells, then you are able to use that information which you've learned in utero about the smell of an individual person to orient towards the food source, which is going to be coming from that particular individual person. So Charles called this the transnatal chemosensory continuity hypothesis. So the idea is that the olfactory environment that you're enveloped in the uterus prepares you to know about how to orient yourself in the olfactory world, which I think is a fascinating idea. Here you can see some of the pictures of some of the techniques which are used to look at olfactory preferences. So pads are placed next to the face, and they look at whether the newborn will orient the nose towards or away from those kinds of pads. So you might be thinking at this point, well, is there anything left for newborns to know about their social worlds if they can make sense of the world of people through vision, touch, smell, and hearing? But of course, there are many things that infants have to learn about. So Olivier Pascalis and colleagues found that what we find in early studies is newborns prefer to look at faces, but they don't necessarily at birth have a sense of individual faces. Now, actually, they're surprisingly good at this. So Pascalis et al. In 1995 asked the question, can they recognize at the face of a specific person, would they recognize specifically the face of their mother as opposed to a strange mother? And they did this in kind of neonatal wards in France, and presented the face of their mother next to the face of a strange parent of another child. And they did all sorts of things like masking the smell by placing a strong apple perfume in the experimental chamber. And this doesn't look like a newborn to me, so I think this might be slightly a study with older infants as well, but they were doing this with newborns. Newborns would look longer at their mother as opposed to the strange mother, indicating a preference for an ability to recognize the mother. Actually, what they found was that when you hid the hair, so when you hid the outline of the face, then that preference disappeared. So what it seems to indicate is that newborns recognize their parent quite early on, but in a different way to how you or I would recognize faces. They tend to focus more on the broad scale aspects of faces, and particularly the outer contours, so hairline and things like that. So when those things are covered up, then they have more difficulty. It's quite interesting that Pascalis et al. Chose to hide the smells, because that obviously might be a really important tool which infants are using. And it's, recent research is looking at, possibly it's the case that infants learn about the particular facial features which help distinguish different people by linking those to the smells of their mother or their father, as opposed to strange other people. So here's Olivier Pascalis, who I've been mentioning, doing some more research. He's got this very strange photo of himself online, which I found it difficult not to put up. He's presumably doing his best to make sure that the infants who's taken his part in his studies over the years can't recognize him by doing this. He's French, but it's obviously an Anglophile, as you can tell by his spectacles. So Olivier did this fantastic experiment in 2002, which I think is really important. It demonstrates something really, really fascinating and strange about how our perceptual abilities to perceive the world, the social world around us, develop. And he found that as infants get older, they start to home in on the perceptual features of faces which are important in their own social environments. So what he did was compare 6- and 10-month-old babies, and he compared their ability to differentiate between human faces and to differentiate between monkey faces. So that he would present 6-month-old babies with one human face, let's say this one here, until they got bored with it, and then he'd present the old one and the new one together, and both 6- and 10-month-old babies would look longer at the new one, demonstrating they could differentiate between human faces. He did this also with individual macaque faces. So these are macaque monkeys, and he found that both 6 and 10-month-olds were also able to differentiate between different individual monkey faces. Well, the fascinating finding is that by 10 months of age, the babies had retained the ability to distinguish between different human faces, but they'd lost the ability to distinguish between different monkey faces. So it's as if your perceptual abilities are really quite broadly tuned when you're born. So you're able to make differentiations between lots of different kinds of stimuli in your perceptual world. But as you get older, you focus in on those perceptual differentiations which are more important for the social environment that you're in. Obviously, most human babies aren't surrounded by many macaque monkeys in everyday life, so they lose the ability to make those kinds of perceptual discriminations, and they hone in on the ones which are more important. Pascal Issertel went on to show that you could manipulate this through the experience, and he sent mothers home, parents home with books of monkey faces with names under them to their baby 6 months of age, and they found that if you did this, then babies would remember or would retain the ability to differentiate monkey faces by the time they got to 10 months of age. Now I'm kind of running out of time, so I'm going to skip over this next slide, which shows the same thing but in the world of sound in terms of speech discrimination. I'll just tell you about this latest study that the last study in this set of slides, which is a study from our lab looking at how babies learn to link the senses together in order to perceive their social world. So this is research led by Silvia Regato, and we're actually continuing this in the Birmingham BabyLab at the moment. We were interested in whether, as has been observed in adults, whether seeing a tactile event, so seeing something visually happening to a hand, let's say a tactile event like this, whether that leads to any kind of tactile response in the infant's brain. So we know that in adults, when we see tactile events happening, we not only can record information, we can record an awareness of that in the visual cortex, but we can also see that seeing a tactile event also has an influence on the observer's the tactile part of the observer's brain. It's almost as if there's some kind of empathic resonance. When you see something tactile happening to someone, you can also feel it yourself in your tactile areas of the brain. So what we did was to show babies either a hand being touched. So this is the paintbrush coming in and touching a hand on the right hand column here and then going away, or the surface of a table being touched next to the hand. So there's no social tactile event happening in this left hand column, but there's a social tactile event happening in the right hand column here. So we showed them these kinds of videos happening of this whilst we were measuring from their brain, measuring somatosensory responses, and we would present little touches to their hands at the same time as the touch was being presented to the hand or the touch was being presented to the surface. And we found that the baby's somatosensory brain would respond to the touch that they were feeling, but it would respond in a modulated way depending on whether they were observing a hand being touched or a surface being touched. So that suggests that what you see modulates the way in which you process tactile information about the world. And it's specifically modulated by whether you see someone being touched as opposed to an object being touched. What we think this might be is possibly the early origins of a kind of sensory basis for empathy. So that when you're feeling at 4 months of age, when you're seeing someone being touched, that also influences the way in which you perceive touch yourself. So these kinds of multisensory connections between visual awareness and tactile awareness might be a sensory underpinning of how we come to have an awareness of how other people feel when they're experiencing things in the world. Yeah, so I'm going to stop there. I mean, I think that just to sum up, newborn infants and even prenatal fetuses can perceive and learn about their social worlds through lots of different senses: touch, smell, sound, and even vision. Social perception develops substantially in the first year, so infants get better at visually identifying particular people in the first few months. And social perception also undergoes perceptual narrowing across the first year, where infants home in on the aspects of their sensory worlds which are most socially important for them. And this last study, I hope, kind of illustrates what I think is quite an important frontier in research at the moment on social perceptual awareness and understanding. So we've been investigating the early origins of a sensory basis of empathy, which might be underpinned by linking together a visual awareness of people with a tactile awareness of oneself and one's own body. So thanks very much for listening to all of that, and I'll hand over now. I've run a little later than I wanted to, but I'll hand over to Alice. Please do ask any questions in the chat, and I'll try and respond to those while Alice is setting up.
Can everyone see that? We're good. Okay. Do you want me to go? Or do you want to wait and see if there are any questions? I'll just go for it.
So please go ahead, Alice. That's great. Thank you.
Cool. So I'm Alice, and like Andy said, I'm about to start my PhD with the BabyLab, looking at self-perception in infancy. I'm currently doing my master's at the moment, and so I'm just going to explain to you how basically we've adapted studies to be online given the pandemic, using the example of my, hopefully, dissertation. We'll see how it goes. So like I say, I'm looking at self-perception, which is sort of very similar to an idea of self-awareness, which is like an infant having a sense of self. You know, when does that develop? And one sort of aspect of self-awareness is the idea of self-recognition. So like recognizing oneself, like physically, your own body. So one of the main ways in which this has been done is with the Mirror Rouge test. So this is an experiment that started off, I think, in animals, but was then adapted for human infants. And basically, you get a bit of like makeup or mark, something can be wiped off the baby easily, and put a little dot like on their forehead, and then put them in front of a mirror. And when they look in the mirror, if they sort of go to wipe their forehead, then you can kind of assume that they're recognizing that the image they're seeing in the mirror is themselves. So they're recognizing that's their face. And they're also recognizing that there's something quote unquote wrong with their face, as in it's the little red mark is not what they'd expect to see. So some of the problems with the Mirror Rouge test, though, have been spoken about. One of these is the idea of mirror exposure. So just the fact that some infants will be around mirrors more often, just based on the fact that some people will have more mirrors in the house. Some people will sit with their baby in front of a mirror. I don't know. I don't have a baby, so I can't comment, but you know, just different infants you see themselves in a mirror more often. And that's particularly important when you're thinking about facial recognition, in the fact that if you're not looking in a mirror, or obviously there's other things like pictures and videos, but the idea is that majoritively infants see their face when they look in a mirror. So if you're less exposed to mirrors, you're probably less likely to recognize your own face. So it's not that infants aren't passing the Mirror Rouge test because they don't have the ability to recognize their own face, but purely that they just don't because they haven't seen it very often. So the idea that we've come up with is that we're going to try and combat this by looking at recognizing the infant's hand. So obviously with your hand, you know, you see your hands all the time. You don't need a mirror to see your hands. It's just something that you see. So we're sort of thinking about doing the idea of the Mirror Rouge test, but putting the little red dot on the infant's hand. So they sort of wave, and then like, for instance, the mirror. And then if they look at their hand or try and wipe off their hands, then they're recognizing their hand in the mirror as opposed to their face. So hopefully that'll start to combat that issue. But then obviously the question arises, how do we adapt this to be online? Obviously, given the global pandemic, we're not having infants come into the lab in person. So just figuring out how we can do this online and still make it an effective study. So there's a few ways in which we're going to do this. The first is, instead of having a mirror, we're going to do it via video. So essentially we'll be using Zoom, and we're hoping that it'll work very similarly. When you go on Zoom, obviously you can make your image the main one. So that's something we'd ask parents to do, so that the infant is looking at their image. And on Zoom, you know, you're looking at a mirror image of yourself. If I raise this hand, when I look in my video, I'm seeing that hand raised as if it's a mirror image. So we're hoping that that'll work in a very, very similar way as if the infant was looking in a mirror. So the other issue we had is the idea of using the makeup or the marker, whatever we'd use as like a physical mark on the infant. One of the reasons why this could be an issue is firstly the idea of the fact that we're using a hand instead of a forehead. Infants are more likely to probably notice if you're touching their hands. Obviously, hands are very, a lot of nerve endings, things like that. Not explain that very well, but as opposed to a forehead, you can probably get away with sort of stroking your infant's forehead and just gently putting on a bit of makeup and they won't notice. The likelihood of being able to do it with the hand is less likely, and they'll probably notice. And the worst part is then they'll just turn over their hand and look at it, and that'll completely ruin the whole experiment. As opposed to if the forehead, they feel the mark, they can't look at the forehead until they're looking in the mirror, so it doesn't really matter as much anyway. The other issue with asking, because we'd have to ask parents to put on the mark, is that people will do this differently. In an experimental setting, you'd have the researcher conducting the research being able to put on the little mark, in which case we could make sure it was consistent, the same size, the same colour, things like that. Whereas obviously in a home setting with parents doing it, we can't ask everyone to do it exactly the same. So we want it to be as standardised as possible. So this is where we come to try and use an app to do this. So basically the app that we've used is a subset of Snapchat, something along those lines. And basically you can create like a filter. So what we've done is create a filter where an infant will put their hand up and a little dot will appear on their hand. And as they move it, it'll stay there. So actually, in this sense, to a certain extent, the idea of putting this study online may in fact increase the how well it works, because like I say, we avoid the issue of it being them noticing it, because it's not going to be on their hand until they raise it. So in a way, this online research has actually potentially improved the research that we'll be doing. Obviously, in a lot of ways, it hasn't. It's a lot more complicated. And I think because it's such a reliant on technology in general, it takes a bit more making sure that it's going to work. So that's sort of the phase we're at the moment with doing our research. Oh, sorry, went the slide back. It won't let me go back. But that's so at the moment, I'll try and show you. This is where we'll see if it works. So if I hold up my hand now, we get a little red dot that appears. I can move it, I can put it down, I can bring it back up, I can switch hands and it'll do it. So the idea is it should be quite straightforward for infants, depending on, we're not expecting them to hold their hand up like this, exactly the same for however long. They can move it around, they can put it down and bring it back. It'll still be there. So I'll just swap back to my other camera. So that's where we're at with it, basically, that online research in some ways can be quite helpful. Also, obviously, can some ways not be so helpful. But it does make it more convenient as well for parents, I think, is what we've kind of had feedback about. There's no traveling involved. So when I start doing the study, please sign up. But yeah, that's everything from me. So, Sophie.
Thank you, Alice. Thank you for everyone for coming this evening. Thanks for giving up part of your evening to be with us. If you could just click the next bit on your presentation, Alice. Thank you. So I'm assuming most of you have signed up to our newsletter already, as that's how we mainly advertise this evening. If you're not, and you're not already on the database, just either pop your email in the chat to me now or send it to the BabyLab email address and I'll get you added to that. And we send them out every couple of months, and it's just recent research, current recruitment, things like that. And we also have our Facebook and Twitter accounts with regular updates. And then we also advertise all our events and stuff on our Birmingham website. So you can find all the info there. And I'm just going to run a quick poll with you all to see what the next webinar topic will be before we go to the questions. Let's see if this works. So your options are methods of research, self-awareness in infancy, sensory development, understanding of the world, and development and motor skills. So I'll just launch that now. You can vote for a couple. I'll just give you a minute to do that. Okay, good, it's working. Few more seconds. Can everybody see the results? I've just shared them. Yeah, so understanding of the world is by far the most popular actually, and then development and motor skills. So we'll our next webinar will be on understanding of the world, and that will probably be in 3 months' time. And we aim to do these every 3 months. And I'll be sending out the details via the newsletter and on all our social medias.